You're listening to Ashes and Candlelight. Quiet history, told slowly, without urgency. If you're settling down to sleep, let the world around you soften a little. There's nothing you need to do now except follow the sound of the story, or let it drift past you, while rest arrives in its own time. Tonight, we return to Venice. Not at the moment of collapse, but at the moment of adjustment. It is the year 1348. The plague has reached the lagoon, and yet the city is still standing. Ships continue to arrive. Water still moves through the canals. Officials still meet, and decisions are still written down. What changes first is not the city itself, but the space around it. Distances grow wider. Silences last longer. The water becomes a boundary. This is not a story of panic, but of waiting. Of how Venice begins to notice patterns, and how fear, slowly and almost quietly, starts to take shape. There is nothing here you need to hold on to. You can listen closely or only in fragments. The city will continue either way. Venice does not react all at once. It never has. The city responds in layers, as though each part is waiting to see what the others will do first, and whether it must move at all. In the spring of 1348, there is no single moment when the plague arrives. There is only a growing sense that something has begun to move closer, and that this movement does not follow the usual patterns of trade or weather. News reaches the lagoon before the sickness does. A ship delayed beyond its expected time, a crew smaller than the ledger suggests, a letter brought ashore that smells faintly of vinegar and smoke, as though it has already passed through several cautious hands. These details are noticed, but they are not yet gathered together. Venice is accustomed to rumours. It has traded in them for centuries. Storms in the Aegean, unrest along the Black Sea, port closed by decree, or by violence, or by nothing more than uncertainty. Absence, in itself, is not unusual here. What begins to feel unfamiliar is how often the absences repeat, and how little explanation accompanies them. A single ship that does not arrive is an inconvenience. Two suggest unfavourable winds. Three, arriving late or not at all, begin to suggest something else, though no one is yet prepared to say what that something might be. Even so, nothing stops. The markets continue to open at dawn. The wells are unlocked and guarded as they always have been. Water still rises and falls against the worn stone steps that lead down into the canals. Oars dip into the water with their familiar rhythm. Wood against water, water against brick. A sound older than memory, and steady enough to hold attention without demanding it. Venice does not panic, because panic would require certainty, and certainty has not yet arrived. At this stage, the plague is not yet visible. It is visible first in the margins, in the quieter parishes where shutters remain closed longer than they usually would, in houses where the knock on the door is answered only after a pause, as if the people inside are weighing something unseen. Neighbours still speak, but they do so from slightly farther away, their voices lowered not by instruction, but by instinct. No law has yet required this. No proclamation has been read aloud. The space simply appears, as space sometimes does, when people begin to sense that closeness may carry a cost. Venice is a city built on water, but it is also a city built on proximity. Narrow bridges, shared courtyards, voices that carry easily across short distances. For centuries, that closeness has been its strength. Now it begins, gently, to loosen. It does not loosen dramatically, nor all at once, but only enough to be felt. A fraction more room between bodies, a moment longer before stepping forward. The change is subtle enough that it might have gone unnoticed, if it had not been shared by so many at once. The soundscape shifts before anything else. Not because new sounds arrive, but because familiar ones begin to thin. Funeral bells still ring, but less often than the number of deaths might suggest. Not because there is less loss, but because there is too much of it to be marked individually, without exhausting those who remain. The city learns, without discussion, that constant sound can overwhelm the living as surely as silence can. So the bells become selective. They mark the hours. They call people to prayer. But they do not always mark death. This absence of sound is not comforting, but it is survivable. Inside the houses, voices grow softer. Windows are opened for air rather than conversation. Meals are taken more quietly, as if loud speech might travel farther than intended. The plague is understood, at this point, as something carried by air that has lingered too long, air made heavy by corruption. So air becomes watched. Vinegar appears everywhere, in bowls near doorways, on cloths used to wipe hands, on letters arriving from elsewhere, which are folded carefully, then held over smoke, before being read. Coins exchanged at the market are dropped into vinegar, then dried, then passed on again, their surfaces dulled by caution. The sharp smell settles into daily life. It does not alarm. It reassures. Smoke follows. Juniper, rosemary, resinous wood burned in small, steady fires. The smoke drifts slowly through streets and along canal edges, softening outlines, muting colour, giving the city a faint haze, as though it is being viewed through a thin veil. Still, the machinery of Venice continues to turn. Officials meet, not to assign blame, and not to speculate, but to record. They note arrivals and departures, illness and recovery, patterns that may or may not become meaningful later. The language remains careful, measured, administrative. No one writes that the city is afraid. They write instead that precautions are under consideration, that conditions are being observed, that time is required. Time begins, quietly, to take on a new role. Not yet in fixed units, and not yet in formal isolation, but in hesitation. A pause before unloading, a request that a ship remain at anchor a little longer than usual. No one says 40 days, not yet, but waiting has begun. The lagoon makes this possible. Water already serves as a boundary here, requiring no wall and no fence. A vessel can be close enough to be seen clearly, and still remain unreachable. This distance feels natural, almost reassuring. So the first separations happen offshore. Ships anchor farther out. Supplies are transferred indirectly, left at a distance, retrieved without contact. Food still enters the city. The city still eats. But exchange becomes indirect. Hands stop touching. The water accepts this role without comment. It holds space where the streets cannot. Inside Venice, people begin to sense that something has shifted. Not enough to flee, and not enough to revolt, but enough to adapt. At this stage, the plague is not yet the centre of life. It is an influence, felt at the edges of decision-making, a reason to pause before proceeding as usual. Venice has always lived with danger nearby. The sea brings wealth and fret in equal measure. So the city does what it has always done. It continues. The first changes do not happen at the city's edges, but in the water that surrounds it. Venice has always relied on distance. Distance measured less in miles and more in effort. The length of a crossing, the patience of an oar, the time it takes for a boat to reach the far bank and return again. In the spring of 1348, that distance begins to thicken. It thickens quietly, just enough to be noticed by those who move across the lagoon every day. Ships still arrive. They follow the same channels, raise the same sails, lower anchors in places they have used before. Nothing about their approach suggests refusal. No signal is given, no warning is sounded, but they do not come as close as they once did. The water between hull and shore is allowed to widen, first by habit, then by quiet expectation. A galley that might have once tied up quickly now waits a little longer offshore. It waits simply because no one has ordered otherwise. The lagoon accepts this easily. It has always been a place where time stretches. Tides pause, boats drift, journeys slow halfway through themselves, then continue when conditions allow. Waiting is already part of the lagoon's nature. Now waiting becomes more deliberate. It is waiting noted rather than enforced. A ship's arrival is recorded. The hour is written down. The distance at which it anchors is observed without comment. Nothing is decided immediately. The pause is not dramatic. It feels like procedure, being given time to find its shape. The water begins to take on a different role. It transforms, slowly, from a surface to cross into a space to be maintained. A buffer. A holding place where movement can slow without stopping entirely. From the decks of the ships, Venice looks unchanged. The domes still rise from the same points along the skyline. The towers hold their familiar outlines against the sky. Smoke still drifts upward from within the city, thin and steady. And yet the city feels farther away. It feels simply deferred. Crew members wait without complaint. They are used to delays. Trade has always involved patience. They mend clothing. They clean tools. They sit in the shade and watch the surface of the water break and reform with the passing of each small wave. This waiting holds a strange familiarity. There is no storm to blame, no damage to repair, no visible reason for the delay to end. Only time. Time measured quietly by the passing of hours rather than the completion of tasks. Small boats begin to cross the water, more often than before. They carry messages instead of people. Words pass across the lagoon where bodies do not. Questions are asked, then asked again, their answers written carefully and set aside. No one raises their voice. No one hurries the exchange. The distance is doing its work. Onshore, the city absorbs this change without discussion. Merchants continue their routines, but with an added step. A glance towards the water. A moment of calculation before proceeding as planned. The presence of ships offshore becomes ordinary. Their masts are counted as part of the horizon, not as arrivals that require immediate attention. They wait, and the city allows them to wait. This space between ship and shore begins to feel purposeful, a space that feels held rather than empty, a place where nothing happens so that something else might not. The lagoon has always separated Venice from the mainland. Now it separates Venice from what it does not understand. The water does not judge. It does not question. It simply remains where it is, wide enough to matter. The distance feels patient. No one speaks of quarantine. Not yet. But the city is learning, slowly and without ceremony, that space itself can be a form of care. That distance, when maintained gently, can serve as restraint. And restraint, in a city built on waiting, comes naturally. The change arrives gradually. It arrives without announcement. There is no single moment when the city becomes quiet. Instead, certain sounds simply fail to return. Venice continues to move, to work, to mark the passing of hours. But some of the signals that once shaped the day begin to thin. For centuries, the sound of bells has structured life in the city. They do more than tell the time. They gather attention. They direct movement. They announce events that cannot be ignored. A bell does not ask to be heard. It insists. At first, the bells continue as they always have. They ring for the hours, they ring for the meetings, they ring for deaths. But as the weeks pass, their ringing begins to feel heavier. It feels simply more present. Each toll carries further than before. For the listener has changed, even if the city has not. What was once ordinary now lingers. The authorities understand this quickly. They are administrators rather than physicians. Their concern lies less with sound itself, and more with its effort. They know that repeated tolling unsettles as much as it informs. It gathers anxiety and releases it across the city, again and again. And so, without ceremony, the ringing begins to change. Funeral bells are shortened. In some parishes, they are omitted entirely. The long toll that once accompanied death through the canals is replaced by something smaller. A brief signal, or none at all. This is distinct from denial. Death is not hidden. Bodies are still moved. Records are still kept. Prayers are still spoken. But the city refuses to let death set the rhythm of the day. The absence is noticeable. At first, people wait for the sound to arrive. They mark the hour by habit. then pause, listening. When nothing follows, they adjust. The hour passes without being marked. Without bells, time becomes less public. It is no longer broadcast across water and stone. Instead, it settles closer to the body. Light through a window, shadow shifting along a wall, the feel of the air changing as evening approaches. The city does not slow. It grows inward. Other sounds begin to surface. The closing of a door carries further than expected. Footsteps on a bridge echo longer. The splash of an oar draws attention simply because it is alone. Without the bells, each sound feels more exposed. People become aware of the noise they make. They become careful rather than fearful. Voices lower naturally. Laughter, when it comes, is brief. It feels contained. The quiet acts less like sleep and more like agreement. A shared understanding that some sounds are no longer useful. That the city functions better when it does not constantly call attention to itself. At night, this restraint deepens. Venice has never been truly dark. Water reflects what little light there is. Movement continues, even after sunset. Now, the night holds more evenly. Without the bells to divide it, the darkness stretches without punctuation. Hours pass without announcement. The city feels closer to itself. Inside homes, habits shift subtly. Doors are closed more gently. Objects are set down rather than dropped. Families speak with awareness, choosing words carefully. The absence of sound creates a kind of exposure. A raised voice travels further than intended. A cough is noticed. The quiet encourages a certain attentiveness. It encourages consideration rather than vigilance. Outside, the canals reflect this change. Gondolas move without calling out. Oars enter the water with measured rhythm. The city's movement becomes less performative. No one announces their arrival. No one demands attention. The restraint requires no force. It is sustained simply because it works. The city feels steadier when it is not constantly reminded of its own vulnerability. Silence becomes a form of administration, a way of holding fear without allowing it to circulate freely. Everyone hears the same absence. Everyone adjusts together. This quiet speaks of coordination rather than abandonment. A city choosing not to disturb itself while it waits. Once the silence settles, it begins to require attention. It requires maintenance rather than enforcement. Silence does not hold itself. It is kept through countless small decisions, most of them unspoken. A voice begins to rise, then lowers. A call is considered, then abandoned. Someone reaches instinctively for a bell rope, then lets their hand fall away. These gestures leave no record. They remain unwritten. They are simply felt and repeated. Over time, the body learns the boundaries. It senses how far sound should travel. Footsteps adjust their weight. Wood is crossed more lightly. Water is entered with care. Oars lift and return without splash. The city becomes skilled at not interrupting itself. Even absence takes on a shape. There is a difference between quiet that arrives and quiet that is preserved. This is the latter. The bells remain in place. They are not dismantled. They are not condemned. They simply wait. Their ropes hang loose. Dust settles along the bronze. The knowledge of their presence is enough. Their silence becomes part of the city's structure, as familiar as stone. People begin to notice when silence is broken. They notice it with recognition rather than alarm. A dropped object, a raised voice. The sound passes quickly, then disappears. The quiet closes around it without comment. No correction is issued. No reminder is needed. Silence has become a shared habit. It belongs to everyone. The bells do not return yet. The hour passes without being marked. And Venice continues, breathing evenly, holding the silence as carefully as it holds the water. Waiting does not arrive suddenly. It arrives without announcement. At first, it feels indistinguishable from delay, from the kind of postponement that maritime trade has always known. A round ship remains where it is. A message sent ashore is left unanswered. A decision is noted by the magistrates, then returned to later. Venice has always understood delay. The city is built on tides, on seasons, on winds that cannot be persuaded. Merchants are familiar with waiting for weather. Officials are familiar with waiting for replies. Sailors are familiar with waiting for clearance. The change now lies less in the presence of waiting and more in its shape. It begins to stretch. It stretches deliberately. Time is given boundaries. An arrival is recorded by the clerks. A date is written down. A period is marked, unexplained, perhaps, yet quietly acknowledged. This resembles quarantine, though it acts, for now, as extended delay. A ship at anchor is no longer waiting to unload. It is waiting to be cleared. The distinction is subtle, yet vital. Clearance implies assessment. It implies observation. It implies that time itself has become a tool. The lagoon makes this possible. Its breadth absorbs duration easily. Ships can remain present without being integrated. From the city, their heavy timber hulls are visible but unchanged. From the ships, the city is close, yet inaccessible. This suspended closeness creates a new experience of time. Days pass without progress. The horizon does not alter. No signal arrives to conclude the pause. And so the waiting settles. On board the anchored galleys, the tools of navigation sit idle. The heavy hemp ropes, stiff with salt and dried pitch, are allowed to hang slack against the masts. The canvas sails are folded, tied down securely, and left to weather the stillness. Without the city's bells to divide the hours, the crews rely on the slow sift of sand. Small glass ampoules are turned by the watchman. Fine dust falls from the upper bulb into the lower, measuring time not by distance travelled, but by duration endured. Waiting, once it settles, begins to change the body. At first, the changes are small, barely noticed. Hunger loosens its schedule. Meals arrive when they arrive. Food is taken simply when it is ready. The body adjusts without complaint. It learns to accept that fullness and emptiness no longer follow a public rhythm. Sleep shifts as well. Rest comes earlier some nights, later on others. People lie awake longer without naming the reason. They wake without urgency. The night is no longer divided into clear portions. It stretches. Time without sound moves closer to the skin. Days begin to feel similar, gently overlapping. Morning light arrives. Work is begun. Work is paused. The body learns to exist inside incompletion. This takes practice. At first, the lack of conclusion creates restlessness. Hands linger without purpose. Eyes return often to the water. But slowly, even this restlessness softens. Boredom appears as a quiet space without instruction. There is nothing to solve, nothing to finish. The body adjusts its expectations. It learns that waiting acts as another condition to inhabit. Breathing steadies, movements become smaller. The city's inhabitants grow accustomed to days that do not resolve. Waiting no longer presses against the nerves. It settles into the background, like weather. and once it reaches the body, waiting becomes durable. Inside the city, the administration of this waiting requires its own physical routine. 3 men have been appointed by the Great Council to observe the health of the Republic. They do not issue grand decrees. They simply watch and they record. In quiet rooms, clerks open heavy ledgers bound in leather and wood. They dip their quills into iron gall ink. The ink flows dark onto the thick, textured rag paper, binding the ships offshore to the memory of the city. The scratch of the nib is quiet, steady, and deliberate. Fine sand is sprinkled across the wet words to dry them, then brushed away, leaving the record permanent. Officials begin to notice that this recorded waiting has effects. It affects trade, and just as deeply, it affects behavior. The longer the pause, the calmer the exchanges become. Urgency fades when no conclusion is promised. Time, when stretched, softens expectations. This is quietly reassuring. It gives shape to fear without allowing it to roam freely. Rather than asking, "When will this end?" people begin to ask, "How long must this hold?" The question shifts, and with it, the emotional weight. Waiting becomes something that can be endured, measured, shared. It ceases to be personal. No one waits alone. Across the lagoon, dozens of ships share the same suspension. Their crews observe one another across the water without speaking. They count the turns of the sand glass quietly. They count with attention rather than impatience. Inside the city, the ledgers reflect this new rhythm. Entries note durations alongside outcomes. A ship has arrived. It has waited. It continues to wait. The act of recording becomes stabilizing. Time written down feels less threatening. And so waiting acquires legitimacy. It becomes authorized. No one speaks yet of 40 days. No number has settled into custom. But the idea has begun to take form. That illness has a course. That danger fades if left undisturbed. That separation, maintained patiently, can do the work that force cannot. The city does not celebrate this insight. It simply incorporates it. Waiting becomes another civic function, like weighing grain, like inspecting cloth, like recording tides. Time is folded into governance. Across the lagoon, the same pattern repeats. A ship arrives. Its sails are lowered. Its heavy iron anchor settles deep into the mud. The arrival is noted. The date is written down in dark ink. Nothing else happens. The next day, the ship remains where it is, its position unchanged. The lagoon provides its own clock. The water retreats with the tide, exposing the dark, damp line of algae along the brick foundations. Hours later, the water rises again, covering the stone, reclaiming the steps. This slow respiration of the sea requires no human oversight. The city continues behind it. The ledger receives another mark. Present. Waiting. Another day passes. The ship is still there. No signal is given. No message alters the record. The entry remains simple. Arrived. Waiting. The repetition itself becomes reassuring. Each identical entry confirms that the system holds. Nothing has been missed. Nothing has escaped notice. Across the lagoon, other ships share the same stillness. Each is recorded separately. Each is held in the same condition. No distinction is made between valuable cargo and ordinary goods. Time applies equally. For the clerks, this repetition becomes routine. The hand moves steadily. The ink dries. Waiting has become something that can be accounted for. And what can be accounted for feels less threatening. The ledger does not hurry. It does not speculate. It simply holds the days. Through repetition, waiting proves itself as a workable state. It does not collapse into chaos. It does not demand resolution. It endures. And because it endures, it becomes trusted. And with that, something fundamental changes. The future is no longer imagined as a sudden return. It is imagined as a gradual release, a waiting that will end in stages. The city adjusts its posture. It leans into duration rather than resisting it. And in doing so, Venice begins, quietly, without declaration, to live alongside restriction. Fear does not last forever. It rises. It settles. It thins. What remains is habit. By the time the first wave of illness begins to ease, Venice has already changed. It changes less in its stone skyline and more in its reflexes. The lagoon is still wide. Ships still arrive. Trade continues. Yet something subtle has taken root. Distance is expected. Where once a vessel approached directly, now it pauses. Where once goods passed quickly from hand to hand, now they wait. The waiting is shorter than before, less tentative, more organized. The city has learned that space can protect. And once learned, that knowledge does not dissolve. Clerks continue to write down arrival dates. They note duration and they mark clearance. These entries become standard. A pattern emerges across the pages of the ledger. Arrival, interval, release. Over time, the interval begins to acquire shape. A period that feels sufficient, long enough for uncertainty to settle, yet short enough for commerce to endure. The number has not yet fixed itself, but the principle has. Time can act as inspection. Time can serve as a filter. And so the city begins to formalize what it has already practiced. Orders are written. Instructions circulate between magistrates. Certain anchor points are designated for longer holding, marked by heavy wooden posts driven into the mud. Certain islands are observed more closely. The lagoon shifts from a simple boundary into an administrative instrument. When a ship arrives now, it is met by a smaller boat. An official approaches, but maintains a careful span of water between the hulls. Documents are requested. They are not handed across directly. Instead, they are placed in the cleft of a long wooden pole and extended over the water. The parchment is taken with iron tongs. It is held over the smoke of burning rosemary or sulphur, purified before it is read. The direction feels entirely ordinary. It is met with quiet compliance rather than spectacle, because the practice has already become familiar. Citizens adapt with similar quietness. A merchant arriving from the mainland expects to wait. A sailor expects inspection. The expectation itself reduces resistance. Habits form in small, tactile gestures. Hands are washed more deliberately. Cloth is aired longer in the sunlight. Coins are still dropped into bowls of vinegar at the market stalls. Strangers are greeted with courtesy, but with space. These gestures are rarely discussed. They remain unwritten. They are simply felt and repeated. Children grow up within this adjusted rhythm. For them, the interval between arrival and entry feels natural. They possess no memory of the time before it. In this way, fear transforms into structure. What began as precaution becomes governance. Magistrates recognize the value of consistency. A fixed duration offers clarity. 40 days is considered. It carries religious resonance. It suggests purification. It suggests completion. Whether chosen for symbolism or practicality, the number settles. 40 giorni. 40 days. From this word, a new language enters the city. Quarantena. the term sounds administrative, measured, routine. By the time the word becomes common, the terror that inspired it has softened. The rule remains, even as fear recedes. Ships that show no sign of illness still wait. Cargo that appears clean still pauses offshore. Letters of origin, stamped with heavy red wax, becomes a requirement for entry. These folded pieces of paper, early passes of health, are carefully carried in leather pouches. They represent a new truth. Movement now requires proof. The waiting becomes identity. Venice begins to see itself as a city that manages risk through patience, through duration rather than force. The lagoon continues to widen and narrow with the tides. The bells return gradually to their former use. Markets grow louder again. Yet beneath the renewed sound remains an unseen framework, an agreement that some distances will always be preserved, an understanding that time itself can defend a city. Those rules seek no heroism and announce no victory. They simply endure. And long after the first memory of fear fades, the interval between arrival and entry continues. Held in ink, held in water, held in habit. The city does not speak of what it survived. It speaks instead of procedure. And procedure, repeated gently, becomes tradition. By the time the rules have settled, they no longer feel new. They feel entirely expected. Ships arrive, they wait, and they are cleared. The interval folds itself quietly into the life of the city. And yet, beneath this steadiness, something else has begun to take shape. Venice shares this encounter with the wider world. Other ports notice the same patterns, and other cities experience the same returns. Rumors travel across the water more quickly than cargo. News of the waiting spreads. News that time itself can serve as protection. Merchants speak of it first. They describe the delay, the careful inspections, and the specific counting of days. At first, these accounts sound peculiar, a strange inconvenience, a peculiarity of the lagoon. But as the years pass, the idea begins to travel. Ports along the Adriatic experiment with similar intervals. Some adopt shorter durations, while others extend them. Yet the principle remains consistent. Arrival does not guarantee immediate entry. Time stands between movement and permission. Venice becomes known for this posture. It becomes known as a city of measured entry. The lagoon offers a visible demonstration of how separation can function without walls. Ships remain present without being absorbed. They hover, they wait, and eventually they rejoin. This choreography begins to influence thought itself. Illness shifts from a sudden catastrophe into something that can be quietly observed. Something that can be given duration. A course. And once it's given a course, it can be managed. The shift is subtle, gently reframing fear. The city moves from seeking total escape to seeking containment within time. This reframing alters governance. Committees are formed. Records are standardized. And islands are designated with clearer purpose. The lazaretto, in time, will emerge from the mist. A physical space neither fully within nor fully outside the city. A space defined entirely by interval. The architecture of patience begins to materialize. Brick by brick, buildings are adapted to hold those who must wait. Open courtyards allow the sea air to move freely. Low walls define boundaries without spectacle. The lagoon, once merely defensive geography, transforms into an administrative landscape. Water acts as a filter. Water acts as a calendar. And beyond Venice, the language spreads. Quaranta giorni becomes quarantine. The word loosens from its origin, entering other tongues, other harbours, and other centuries. The number of days may change, but the principle endures. Time as precaution. Time as safeguard. The future begins to carry this imprint. Centuries later, when illness returns in different forms, cities will reach for the same instinct. Distance, interval, observation. The shape first traced in the lagoon will echo far beyond it. Yet in 1348, this feels distinctly ordinary. It feels like simple adjustment, free from any sense of grand invention or historical precedent. Only the quiet understanding that some arrivals must pause before they enter. Venice seeks no recognition as a model. It simply continues its practice. Ships approach. They wait. They join. The bells resume their fuller voice in time. Markets regain their volume. Children grow into adulthood with the interval standing as part of their memory. What began as a response has become an inheritance. The city holds the water exactly as it always has. But now it also holds a concept. The understanding that the future can be shaped by what is allowed to slow down. The lagoon reflects the sky as evening settles. Boats drift gently between wooden markers, placed with quiet intention. The surface remains entirely steady, yet within it, a new idea has taken root. An idea that will travel farther than any ship. Venice continues, breathing evenly, the water rising and falling beneath it, and time held gently between arrival and release. Evening settles quietly as light thins along the edges of the domes. The water reflects what remains of the sky, softening the lines of the city until stone and air seem to merge. Venice has endured countless evenings like this, some marked by celebration, others by heavy memory, yet this one is simply quiet. Boats rest gently against their moorings. Wood touches water with a deeply familiar sound. A lantern is lit somewhere beyond view, its glow drifting outward before it steadies. When the bells eventually return, they will ring as they always have, marking the hour and gathering attention. Yet beneath their sound, the interval will remain. The memory of waiting needs no announcement. It lives in the small adjustments that no one thinks to name, in the space left between bodies, in the pause before entry, in the habit of writing dates with disciplined care. The lagoon continues its slow exchange with the sea. Water moves outward, and water returns. Everything moves with an unhurried grace, following a patient, natural wait. Venice was built on this rhythm long before illness came, and it survives by leaning into it. Arrival, interval, release. The pattern holds. Even now, in the fading light, ships can be seen resting at a distance. They rest suspended, simply held in time. Night gathers slowly across the lagoon. Windows dim one by one as voices soften and footsteps fade. The city simply continues, keeping its resilience private and its history quietly absorbed. Breathing evenly, holding its distance, trusting the water to keep what must be kept apart. And somewhere beyond the horizon, other cities prepare their own evenings. Other harbours measure their own intervals. The idea has already begun to travel. But here, in this hour, there is only the lagoon and the slow settling of light. You do not need to hold any of this. The water will remember its rhythm. the city will continue its quiet adjustments, and the night will arrive, whether you are listening or already drifting into rest.